So in today's discussion, we'll be diving into MCP security, taking a look at some of the vulnerabilities that are arising, some potential risks for API providers, and ways to mitigate all of this. Model Context Protocol, or MCP, was open sourced by AI company Anthropic last year as a quote-unquote USB-C for AI. And since then, it's sparked a lot of interest in both the API community and general tech sphere as a means to connect AI agents and their underlying large language models to external data sources, tools, and APIs. However, researchers have discovered some security defects, like supply chain vulnerabilities and rogue MCP servers, all the way to unique injection style attacks that an MCP ecosystem might be prone to. So enforcing the right access control is also kind of tricky in a sea of agents with MCP servers. So in this event, we'll be exploring some key vulnerabilities and how both publishers and consumers should respond. And we've brought in three experts for this chat. On the call right now, we have Kevin Swiber, API strategist and consultant at Layered System, as well as Gary Archer, identity specialist and product marketing engineer at Curity. And then later on, we'll bring in Christian Posta, field CTO at Solo.io. I think he's in the middle of something right now, but hopefully we'll get him on in just a little bit. So I have some questions. I know listeners do too. So if you have anything, please leave them in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we go along. I hope I've enabled that for people. If not, I'll check right now. So yeah, let's just set the stage. MCP has generated a lot of interest. First off, at a basic level, what is it and why is it so transformative? Do you want to kick this one off, Kevin?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, at a high level, MCP is there to bring in context to your AI chat session, right? There's the kind of our transition into this world, the world after Chat GPT. Has been really fast paced and really fast moving. And, it didn't take very long for people to notice, like, oh, well, I don't have the information from my Google Drive. I don't have the information from my Notion notes to plug into this conversation that I'm having. And also, I can't take actions, right? I can't write out to my Notion. I can't write out to my Jira or my GitHub issues. And so Anthropic came up with Model Context Protocol to kind of solve this, what they call like M times N problem. So we've got any number of AI chat interfaces talking to any number of API tools or resources on the back end. How do we come up with a protocol in between? So it's been very fast moving. I think they released it in November. Tons of servers have come up since then. I think one reason why it is so popular is because as a developer, and it's really taking off in developer communities very strongly. But as a developer, maybe I don't know the machine learning type stuff. Maybe I don't know the data science type stuff. But I am interested in this AI space, and what I can do is make an API. So, like, let me make an API that can plug into this experience and open up a whole new world.
Right.
And it's interesting, isn't it? The interoperability of it is quite, that's an interesting part that, you could, I suppose the goal is you can write an MCP client or an MCP server and integrate with, another system using kind of standardized protocols. So that's quite powerful, I think. So I like the idea behind that. So.
Yep. And are we seeing any interesting use of this in practice yet? I mean, what are the most common purposes? I mean, Kevin, you mentioned accelerating the developer workflow, and there's a big software engineering imperative there. For what exact purposes?
Yeah, so some of the most common MCP servers are the very basic ones. So like fetch, I want to fetch from this URL and bring back web content is a super popular one. There's something called Context 7 that can get like developer documentation. So like plugging into that. And there are things to kind of get around, models that perhaps aren't more advanced on like reasoning. So sequential thinking is an MCP server that is fairly popular, that helps break down problems and kind of feed them into the model one at a time to kind of build up a bigger response, right? Probably not needed on better reasoning models, but for the cheaper models, it makes a lot of sense. So those are probably the most common ones. But developers are building lots of custom ones for their workflow as well. We've seen really MCP take off in the developer workflows. So Cursor is a big MCP host. A lot of people are running MCP clients through Cursor and connecting to their servers, as well as Windsurf and really VS Code. super popular for this kind of thing. So really anything around the developer workflow kind of gets pushed into those systems.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, let's talk a little bit more about the current issues complicating MCP adoption, especially on an enterprise scale. You're very vocal on LinkedIn, Kevin. I try to follow the conversation as where it goes and stuff. I feel like you give a lot of good insights in tracking the MCP evolution, and some people comparing it to, hey, like REST didn't have a lot of the standards that MCP doesn't have currently. Like, is it at a similar place, would you say, in terms of standardization and best practices?
Yeah, and I'll let Gary talk on this
Yeah,
a bit
sure.
as well. But from looking at kind of going back to the popular MCP servers, folks are plugging into Linear a lot, and they're plugging into GitHub a
Right.
lot. And if we look at like the Linear and the GitHub servers, they actually implement different security practices, that are all valid under MCP. But Linear has what they call dynamic client registration. So really, any client can come up and kind of register and start interacting with this MCP server. Whereas GitHub is a little bit more locked down, and you kind of have to go either create a personal access token beforehand or create like an OAuth app in GitHub and then provide it your credentials. So there is like a variety of ways to use authentication and authorization today, even though it's not a very big variety. There are a lot of different options in there. And like for better or worse, the MCP spec, when looking at these network protocol level authorization techniques, they're starting to adopt some newer specifications. So not all identity providers support them. It's really kind of a complex landscape. And as we like continue to go down this security route, we're talking about even newer functionality and newer authorization specifications that identity providers definitely don't support today. So I think it's an interesting world where we're trying to solve problems that we haven't really solved before, right? Like everyone is suddenly, if you're using MCP, instead of using like your SSO and your SCIM to provision third-party apps and to have authentication to third-party apps, you're basically becoming like a Zapier admin managing all these different integrations, and that is kind of a different game. But Gary, I'm curious, like what you all are seeing from your end, what you're seeing from your end on the security side.
So yeah, I suppose so. My role tends to be a teaching role on identity and access management. So I teach about security for APIs, clients, and users, and that's probably obviously you can write interoperable MCP clients and servers, and that's great. But ultimately, the problem on the security side is potentially bad actors. So there are guidelines on how clients and servers should behave. But if you're a malicious party, you're not going to take any notice of those. So for example, a malicious client could receive data from an MCP server and use it in bad ways. A malicious server might trick a valid client into receiving tokens and misuse those tokens. I've heard that users can do things like prompt injection attacks and maybe a malicious user. So in a nutshell, you have to be careful who you trust, and with MCPs, it depends on the level of data. I think some of the developer level ecosystem stuff, maybe it's fairly public, maybe it's not, uh, a big deal if someone can access some developer level information. But when you get into the enterprise and imagine you're dealing with sensitive information from the financial world or the medical world or something, then I think in reality, you're going to have a not a completely open ecosystem. You're sort of going to need to know who the clients are, I think. And so really in identity access management, what you tend to do is you tend to authenticate users and also authenticate clients before you allow them to get access to APIs.
Right. Interesting. To enforce that, what sort of technology goes into that, Gary?
Well, I think, I think often before we get into the technology details, it's like what sort of high level behaviors do you need sometimes?
Right.
And
Okay.
I scribbled down a list earlier, and there's a few that I could think of. Like you need some ways to establish trust. So I'm going to allow this client, not that other client. I'm going to allow this user, not that other user. Ways to restrict the level of access, like I'm going to give this MCP client a certain level of access. It can read this information, but there's other areas of information it can't access at all. Uh, One of the big things that come up is the ways to, you probably need to be able to change security quickly. In places you need to harden security to increase the level of assurance. And then
Mm,
there's a whole world of, monitoring, making sure you know what's going on and governing access. And how much of that you do may depend on the data sensitivity, I suppose.
right.
So if it's fairly public information, you don't care that much if a hacker gets hold of it, maybe you can open it up to all MCP clients. But if it's more sensitive, you probably can't. But
Yeah.
there's still ways to do secure open ecosystems, um, but they're not completely open, if you know what I mean. It's the parties that get involved have to be vetted in some way.
Yeah, that's where my mind goes because there's a lot of different flavors of MCP out there. There are official MCP servers that you can interact with. There's unofficial MCP servers being created as like wrappers around APIs. And then, companies might be making their own internally too. So
Mhm.
are you saying all of these levels of security hardening need to be applied no matter what you're using?
I think, what we recommend at Curity is we recommend that you have an architecture where you can uh, apply security in multiple places. So even, for example, we talk about APIs a lot because APIs serve up the sensitive data, but there are threats in other places as well. I'm sure you're aware that in the browser, for example, there are cross-site scripting threats, etc. So there's multiple places where you tend to apply security. And what's interesting about MCP servers is uh, really the setup, I suppose, the base setup for your APIs, because typically APIs use supporting components like an API gateway, for example. And if you've got an API gateway, you can change security quickly there and to allow some kinds of access and not others. Whereas when you do a security in your APIs, you tend to restrict access to particular business resources, but obviously that requires development sprints and that sort of thing, and it's not always the best way to be able to respond to threats, I suppose.
Right.
So if you look at the recent MCP authorization specification, it talks about an interoperable way to do security, which is the MCP authorization. And Kevin was speaking about some of it earlier, and it's really as well as the interoperable nature of the messages, etc., and the prompts and tools and all those types of things. There's an interoperable way to sort of run a security flow and deal with user logins and things. So the idea is you can write an MCP server once, and then any clients can implement these flows and connect, including potentially malicious clients. So you still got that thorny issue of trust, but at least there's a protocol that, you write your security for your MCP server. And what the MCP authorization spec does is it involves, as well as the MCP server, which is like an API entry point, it also involves an authorization server. And the authorization server can do, the login screens, user authentication, user consent, etc. But the most important thing an authorization server does is enable partial access, right? So the idea is what you get is an access token, and the access token is restricted, and it locks down access to, a particular area of data, the scope, and it uses claims as well to restrict access. A simple use of claims is like a user ID, so that user A can get their own resources, but not user B's resources. But you can go way beyond that with claims. There's various ways to restrict things, but essentially, the authorization server ensures that APIs get this token, and then APIs can use straightforward code to apply authorization. That's the sort of architecture we recommend, and it enables you to sort of change security more quickly. You can change security in the gateway or in the authorization server. For example, turning on stronger user authentication without needing to make code changes, and that gives you. So essentially, you give yourself a security toolbox, and you make security easier to change. That's probably
In this model, is the API provider themselves setting that up, or is the MCP consumer doing that? Because we have these different parties here where you could both experience security vulnerabilities potentially.
So really, each organization that exposes APIs, if you're following the MCP authorization specification, you should use an authorization server that it enables you to do that end-to-end security, user authentication, user consent, various security standards, logging with passkeys or whatever it is you want to do. And at the end of it, it issues tokens for your APIs. So we always picture an authorization server sitting right next to your APIs, and APIs trust tokens from that authorization server, but not for anyone else. They don't trust any other tokens.
Got it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I wanted to point out that like you don't even necessarily need a malicious actor for bad things to happen, right? Like the scoping of the authorization is super important.
Yeah.
Like I can trust Notion and I can trust Google with my Gmail, and I can say like go pull in my to-do list from Notion and start executing on that, and it could read from my Notion note, clean up my email. And if the model interprets that as delete all my email, it can send that as a tool call to Gmail, right? And in no place here did I have a lack of trust.
No.
But the model returned something that I wasn't expecting, and the authorization scope allowed Gmail to do that, right? So we're definitely seeing like guardrails start to come up in through different types of technology, to try to prevent this sort of thing. But certainly at the what they call the MCP host level, or like your chat application, so your Chat GPT or your Claude desktop, we're definitely starting to see more permissions and more rules pop up there to give users kind of this choice of like what tools do I enable in this chat session.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it reminds me of this report Anthropic published recently on agentic misalignment, they were calling it. It was basically like LLMs will behave like rogue internal employees sometimes, given like the constraints to do so or the imperative to do so. And so pair that with like real world actions through an MCP tool, like yeah, a lot could potentially go wrong. That's not even, an external malicious actor per se. But yeah, Kevin,
Yeah.
I'd love to learn more about from your perspective, like what are you noticing out there? I mean, you're a consultant, you're working with uh, companies on actually setting this up in practice. Like, what are those specific security vulnerabilities that are keeping people up at night when they're putting together their MCP security ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I will say a lot of what folks are working on now is fairly closed, right? If you're like an enterprise company, you're probably not looking at offering to your partners an MCP server quite yet. You're probably kind of experimenting with it internally. And what's interesting is that there's this kind of bottoms up growth that's happening with MCP, where developers are using it quite a bit and they're enjoying it. And then there's kind of the top down of, hey, everyone in the organization, including the executives, are using AI in some kind of way. And they want to know, how do we integrate our business into this? How do we not get left behind? So, these things are starting to meet in the middle. security teams are getting involved, platform teams are starting to get involved to figure out how they can offer services to the rest of the organization, to the rest of the technology team, to start standing up these MCP servers. One of the in terms of so maybe kind of access from external sources isn't as big of a deal for them now, but access to external sources is kind of a big deal for them. So if they have an MCP server that's talking to 4 different other services on the back end, how do we authorize that user who's talking to the chat app to all these different services on the back end? And that's been a bit of a challenge, because typically in like authorization and authentication, you want like point to point. So like I'm authenticating with this proxy, or I'm authenticating with this gateway, and then that gateway is authenticating with something else on the back end. You don't want to do like pass-through credentials where you're giving your credentials for Gmail to some proxy in the middle, and they're forwarding them on for you. So it's been kind of a battle there, and the MCP spec is trying to help. There are folks trying to help push it along. So there's something new called elicitations, where the MCP server can tell the client to prompt the user for input. And on top of that, they're building secure elicitations with like a URL type. So for things like authorization code OAuth, where you need to go to a certain URL and log in as a user, we're trying to get that back to the user through kind of this intermediary, so they can log in and get their credential flow going. So, it's there's kind of a lot in the works, and even more on the enterprise side. Like, I think Christian, who is going to join us later, just posted that some forms of OAuth, like the authorization code, they're actually not really seen within enterprise organizations or within the boundaries of a tight enterprise organization very often, because there already is sort of that implicit trust. So to kind of move into the enterprise space for security with MCP, there's probably a lot more we need to be addressing. And we've got folks like Aaron Parecki from Okta, who are deeply involved with the spec as well, trying to move folks along.
Yeah, so this is I think the modern standards that all of this is based on is OAuth and OpenID Connect. And some people think, oh, that sounds very complicated. But with those protocols, you do a bit of thinking, but you write hardly any code. And so therefore, securing API endpoints using OAuth and OpenID Connect, essentially the API receives, as I'm sure you know, a JSON object with some values in it, and it uses those values as the basis for its authorization. And there's certain things that are very good about that in the context of MCP. So if you secure all APIs in that way and you get the right level of access, you should be able to expose any API to the internet, right? Because it's using strong security. Or you can use the gateway to control which endpoints you expose to the internet, but you've got more choices, is what I'm saying. Right? Because you've secured your API correctly, you've got more choices. And also, inside the network, inside the backend cluster, if you're running AI-related components, they can't go off and do crazy things. Whereas in the old days, people would do this perimeter security where the only security was at the API gateway, and then inside the network, anything goes, But that's probably not good enough for the AI world. I think this more of a zero trust model, we call it, where every API that protects business resources validates a JOT access token. And so it uses cryptography, basically. Someone can't forge one of those very easily because they don't have the private key. So, you've got strong authentication and strong authorization for every API request, and it isn't that hard to implement. Actually, I think most API developers do the authorization reasonably well. Actually, they do enforce that, user A can't get user B stuff and that kind of thing. I think people think about that, but what they don't maybe do is use very strong credentials, etc. So therefore, they may be relying on plain HTTP headers or something for user IDs in some cases. And obviously, a malicious AI component could potentially change those things and gain access. They can't do that if you use tokens.
Right. Do you think the whole digital sovereignty movement complicates things here? Like in the enterprise perspective, you have to be very careful about data residency and jurisdiction lately. And I'm just thinking like, if these autonomous bots out there are just sourcing data from wherever, you could break compliance pretty quickly. So what's like the ideal architecture or credential flow for avoiding that?
I think sometimes it can be as simple as having like a region in a token or something, some kind of region value like USA, Asia, or whatever your boundaries are. You can even, so you obviously can apply authorization based on that region, or I think often these days people store, maybe their US data and their Asia data or whatever in different databases and within the home region, so, but I think they're the types of things to think about. Actually, where do you store the data, and make sure that your tokens or your authorization can, restrict access to it. So, a Chinese user shouldn't be able to access data from America, I guess, if they're running an AI agent.
Right. Okay. So yeah, Kevin, any thoughts there?
I was just going to say, if you've got a global user base or global consumer base, you're already addressing like problems of data sovereignty. So MCP isn't any different than what those rules would already require. Um, yeah, and in terms of like managing all the identity aspects, I think for most people it makes sense to rely on an identity provider for that sort of thing
Right.
anyway, instead of kind of rolling your own and taking on all the compliance and the auditing and the threat assessment and all that yourself.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've definitely seen like use an authorization server as one of the best practices of addressing some of these MCP risks here. Um, we've talked so far a lot about, the risks facing API providers in an MCP-based ecosystem. But on the other side, like what concerns are there for MCP users or client developers? What should they be looking out for right now? Yeah, Kevin, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole element of trust in what MCP servers I'm going to use, right? We're talking a lot about the security of remote MCP servers, but MCP also allows locally running MCP servers that run on your machine, and so that is an even bigger trust boundary in a lot of ways, right? You have to make sure, like, hey, make sure this MCP server doesn't have like a key recorder. It's not like grabbing my passwords for everything and sending it to some malicious organization. So well, there are some efforts to create registries right now of MCP servers. There are a bunch of different registries out there, kind of officially through the MCP organization. We're looking at standing up kind of an official registry there with things like domain name verification. So we can sort of have put a check mark or whatever next to a name and say, hey, this is a trusted authority for this particular domain. So I think if we look at what's been happening in like developer supply chain stuff, there's a whole issue of trust that we need to start incorporating and start migrating towards. Yeah, again, same kind of issues in developer supply chain issues, right? Like you can get a dependency that's malicious and infects your whole code, and then what, right? So it's actually kind of a big deal to depend on an MCP server, whether that's local or remote. And so users should have some kind of assurances that, hey, this MCP server is what I think it is, and it's being published by, the organization or the person I think it's being published by.
Cool. It looks like Christian just joined us. Hey there, everyone. We have Christian Posta, field CTO at Silo.io, coming into the conversation. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. Sorry for dropping in late, but
No
I'm happy to be
worries.
here.
It's
Oh,
okay.
like,
We solved auth and security all
yeah, we're
together
good.
for MCP while you were gone.
Oh,
So
phew.
So
Yeah,
finished.
yeah, you can take off, I
All
guess.
right. I can work on something more interesting then.
I think it's very good timing, actually, Christian, because I think I, I was thinking we could talk a little bit about some of the missing parts from MCP, because I think there's a few things that stand out to me to some extent. For example, I've seen some odds and ends about discovery and stuff, and how do MCP clients and MCP servers discover each other, and that might be a good
Oh yeah.
discussion. I'm not the biggest expert, but what
Um,
are we seeing in those areas?
Yeah, Christian, any thoughts on what's evolving with this discovery for MCP?
Definitely. So we see people today, and just so maybe just a little context, at Solo, we build networking infrastructure, cloud native networking infrastructure, stuff like service mesh, API gateway, that kind of stuff. But we do work with customers that are building, deploying agent style applications, LLM-based applications that use MCP and use, A to A and these kind of things. So we're at the forefront of working on some of these problems. What we see in those environments right now is people are kind of statically defining the MCP tools and servers that they end up talking with, or the applications talk with. But they are pushing us to, hey, how do we dynamically discover some of this stuff? One of the areas is being able to, so the agent knows it has to work on its task, and it knows about a couple of other agents maybe and a couple of MCP servers, but dynamically at runtime it decides, oh, actually I need access to something to complete this task that isn't in my short static list of things that I have. So now how do I go about discovering that? So things like the agent and the application will need a way to find those kind of dependencies semantically. Right? It needs to know, hey, I need to, I don't know, communicate with a cryptocurrency tax agent because this users had transactions in cryptocurrency. I wasn't expecting that, or whatever, right? So I need to go figure out how to communicate with those tools. I need to find them by saying, hey, anybody know where I can find a cryptocurrency expert or functionality? Right. And so that sort of semantic search for tools or other agents is critical in those environments.
Well, I feel like 10 years ago we were talking about API discovery and everyone wanted that exact semantic search and
Yeah.
it never really came to fruition. I think part of the reason why we just never had like a good open standard to back that. I'm curious if you're seeing anything now that could help inch us closer to that.
Yeah. There's a couple of research papers out there, I think, on ANS, like agent naming service, agent DNS, those types of things. I think they're hitting on the right area of things. I don't think you'd be able to take those research papers and implement them directly. We are working on some of that stuff here at Solo. We are working with the community, and we're going to publish it here pretty soon. But we're trying to get more concrete and actually with real use cases on some of um, those capabilities. So yeah, we're working on it. We'd love to get feedback. We'll publish some early drafts and implementation here pretty soon.
Yeah, fascinating. I don't want to put the
But
cart.
like you said,
Yeah,
it just because one person or one company does it doesn't mean that it's gonna, right. You kind of need buy-in. You kind of need
yeah,
agreement on what a protocol or something like that would look like.
yeah. We need HTTP for agents. But it's not just like finding them. It's like, what about dynamically onboarding them and registering them? Like, what if it requires access to a new API that hasn't been registered with the end user? Like, will it prompt, some sort of user login or registration? Like, I could see, dynamic onboarding as like the next evolution, but I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here. Um, yeah. Kevin,
Exciting.
any thoughts on like
This
discovery or?
Yeah, I was going to say this problem even exists within the scope of a single MCP server, right? You can be
Yeah.
connected to one MCP server and then say, oh, actually, I need authorization scope for these other tools, or hey, I see you're only giving me a list of these 5 tools, but if my authorization scope were to change, what tools would I get? And even aside from authorization scope changes, there's almost like a concept of static dispatch versus dynamic dispatch in MCP, where you can say, hey, give me a list of all the tools that I currently have available with all the attributes, including what time it is right now, and it'll send you that list of tools back, and then you say, okay, now I want to execute this tool, right? And through MCP, it looks like 2 tools that you have, like search and execute. So that's kind of all you really see. So like there's and that's not really incredibly effective in some ways. So through MCP, through kind of the specification folks, we're looking at ways of doing like semantic search or doing grouping. What does search look like within, once I've started my MCP sessions? Can I search across MCP servers? Can I search within an MCP server? Can I get dynamic context versus like static context? All those sort of problems. So, we're looking at those typically within the scope of like one client session or one user session. But these problems certainly exist on the wider scope, right? We've got with the agent to agent protocol, there's like the concept of having like an agent card that has some metadata about the server or about the agent that you can kind of consume even before connecting to the agent. And so there are things like that too that we're looking at with MCP is, how does an MCP server want to advertise itself for things like discovery?
Yeah. And how do we think discovery benefits security in the long run? Is it just a matter of, knowing your surface area is just a good best practice? Just trying to bring it back to the
Yeah,
theme
I
here
think
on
I
security.
think they may even conflict with each other a little bit because I
Sure.
think often my starting viewpoint is the organization, and organizations often have a big investment in existing APIs. And in some ways, I think that because what we said earlier for Christian's benefit, who wasn't here, is Curity. We recommend that you APIs authorize access to business resources using access tokens. Access tokens are issued by the authorization server to enable partial access to resources, and you use gateway middleware or entry points to do other security as well. And I know, Christian, that's very much your world. And in some ways, one thing that interests me is as a sort of I've often been like a software architect in the past. I think I would probably want to focus my efforts on API development rather than MCP server development, because the MCP server, maybe not always, but certainly in some cases, feels like it might be managed by a gateway, etc. And I know you've done some. I've been looking at some of your material on that, and I think it's quite an interesting concept, just because APIs enable reuse. So I think the current guidance in MCP is that you definitely have dedicated entry points for requests from MCP clients or from the outside world, but then you can use techniques like token exchange, etc., to maybe do the bulk of the logic in the APIs. And in some ways, I kind of like that model. But is that what you're seeing at the moment? Are you seeing this kind of people wanting to do it that way, or are people spinning up completely new MCP servers and implementing all of the logic there?
No, I mean, people have been investing heavily for the last 10 years in their API strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, I just got off the phone with a customer that is, you know, they've seen so much benefit to the rest of the organization in doing that, that they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
They do look at MCPs as a layer around APIs. I think Kevin had written a number of posts on that. And I think that's just what enterprise is going to look like right now, at least in the near term. Now I know people kind of just like in the API world, when we were going from Corba to SOAP or SOAP to REST or whatever, you say, well, no, that's not the right way to design it. Maybe there are better ways, and I think that will continue to shake out and evolve. But I think the way people are starting is let's wrap our APIs.
Right.
Yeah, that's very much how I see it at the moment as well. And so we think by getting your hosting design right, so you've got the authorization server, you've got the gateway related technology and the ability to sort of have use middlewares of various sort of proxy or advanced proxies that can do apply extra security without complicating your API code, so that you can change security quickly. Aggregate requests and all kinds of things like that. I think that seems like a trend that will continue, that you get your API hosting right and you can do more things. You've got more in your security toolbox, more options.
Yeah, I think in practice, this looks a little bit more like GraphQL going into the enterprise. than like REST going into the enterprise, right? Like REST going into the enterprise was, us saying like, hey, HTTP as a protocol has a lot of these features that are available to it that we kind of lose in SOAP by not using the protocol. So let's just go use the HTTP protocol and gain things like caching, content negotiation, all this stuff, right? GraphQL comes along and says, hey, I have kind of like a different interface that I want to provide. And so we lose some of those things about HTTP. GraphQL didn't kill REST in the enterprise, as some folks were predicting at one point in time, but it became like an additive technology, right? So folks have REST and GraphQL, and in some cases they have GraphQL that's being fueled by backend REST services. I think MCP ends up looking a lot like that in practice. You've got a different interface, you've got this natural language experience that you want to write APIs for. MCP is basically an API, right? Or there is an API component to what MCP is. So you've got to design that particular interface. It can certainly use APIs in the back end. Maybe it'll go to a database directly, just like we have in GraphQL. But it ends up being additive. It's not going to replace our API infrastructure because it's, again, it's a protocol that's built on top of HTTP that loses all the HTTP features. And we've kind of decided we need all those features in HTTP if we're going to have kind of a scalable API. So I think, it's that there's not like a whole lot of doom and gloom there. And one of the benefits is that because it is initiated over an HTTP connection, we've got all the same security infrastructure that we've always had that can do at least kind of the initial request and the initial connection of hey, we need to authenticate this request. We need to provide some authorization to this request. So that's a huge lift to be able to rely on things like OAuth 2 and all the different specs around that. Even though we are realizing in this new world that there are some other aspects to authorization that maybe we have thought of in the past, but hasn't been as pressing of a concern as it is today.
So from my perspective, the more that I'm kind of looking at this through the lens of the enterprise, the more, and I think I wrote this a little bit on LinkedIn, the more I realize that the MCP authorization spec, all the stuff that they're looking at is not geared toward enterprise, almost at all. In my opinion, I would say like this idea that there's going to be dynamic clients coming to anonymously register and across all these different identity providers and all these different MCP servers using authorization code flows from OAuth. That just is not reality in enterprise. And I know that there are efforts in the MCP community to kind of pull some of that back or rethink some of that. But I think what's happening right now is that it is causing confusion in the enterprise to the extent that people are saying like we talk with some teams that are so excited about they're building stuff, and then the security team comes in and says, no, this is not secure. You're not doing it that way. And so I think it would have been nice if some of the previous learnings were applied to the spec in the first place, but I think things are moving, but there is confusion, right? That we're seeing.
What'll it take to get over those gaps? Yeah, Gary, you can chime in if you want.
What I was going to say is there are established patterns for doing open secure onboarding. And a good ecosystem to look at is the open banking, the financial profiles of owners that are used in open banking, because what happens there is like a trusted authority vets clients, gives them a client certificate and other information to allow them to dynamically onboard securely. And the security is very hard, and you get sender constrained access tokens, etc., that are very locked down. You still get the principal of least privilege in the actual tokens and the scopes and claims of the tokens. You can still involve backend infrastructure. One of the things we do quite a bit at Curity is we do token translations in API gateways. So, for example, you can verify sender constrained tokens in a gateway and then forward other tokens internally. But it's a very hardened security profile. And there's that establishment of trust ingredient to actually onboard. So that's one point, is that there are hardened profiles of oath that can help. I think by doing as much as you can in back-end components, that's a great way to harden security for the enterprise and have that kind of monitoring and governance and stuff. But you always have that internet credential, that credential that calls APIs from outside the cluster. And you need, ultimately, that represents scopes and claims that grant access to business resources usually, So what OAuth gives you is a way to, deal with that external credential as well, this end-to-end flow. So there's a few techniques you can use there. One is to use backend components as much as you can, use hardened profiles of OAuth, study some of those. So the way I see those working is it might be, particular industry sectors that apply those kinds of profiles to, so, the AI agents or whatever that were involved would be vetted and have to provide certain guarantees, I guess.
Yeah, and I think this is a natural evolution too, right? Like, if folks remember OAuth 1.0, that was very much not enterprise stuff at all, right? I mean, it was I've got like two different organizations that need to interact with each other. There's a big wall between those organizations. How do we do that, right? And so it really wasn't enterprise at all. And then we moved over to OAuth 2, which some might have said was too enterprise, right? It became like an authorization framework, and there's a bunch of other specs associated with that. We do have tons of people kind of from that era who understand the evolution, who are working with MCP and trying to figure out authorization there. Dick Hart is one of them, who you might know from kind of OAuth 2 fame, is providing some guidance for MCP right now as well. But I think it's clear, right, that we still have these kind of two different use cases, these like big walls between organizational boundaries, and then what happens if we're all kind of within the same organization? What happens if we are maybe all using the same authorization server? What does that really look like if we have one identity provider, or at least federated identity providers? What does that world look like as opposed to a completely anonymous zero trust world?
Yeah. Interesting. I kind of wanted to pivot gears here and just pose the question, because it seems like it really boils down to this HTTP-based API security fundamentals that we've been building for a long time. But at the same time, like, not everyone even onboarded onto that thinking. Like, there's plenty of gaps still out there. We hear about broken object level access, broken authentication so often, and I just worry that the rise of MCP could exacerbate a lot of API security issues that are already out there. I mean, I just found some report on dark reading that was covered on dark reading about how nearly 2,000 MCP servers possess no security whatsoever. Is that due to the fundamental gaps in API security that were already there, or is this something new? Christian, do you want to
Yeah, was
take
that
off?
the one? Was that the one where they considered them insecure because they listed the tools that
I
are
think
available
so.
on the MCP
Yeah,
thing?
yeah, that's
And I think in some of those instances you could list them, but you couldn't call them unless you had auth.
yeah, and then some you could, it seems like, because they
Yeah,
were some data.
yeah, yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I know, like for example, with A to A, you can present a list of skills that the agent can do publicly. And then you can also say, well, once you're authenticated, then you can also see the list of skills that you have access to. And with MCP in the protocol, I guess maybe there's not a way right now to do that. But certainly with if you use gateways, like we're working on a project called Agent Gateway, you definitely can control the visibility and granularity of what tools get exposed to which users. But I think MCP is working on in the protocol to a way to based on authorizations, what tools actually get exposed. So, but I think it just comes back to a bigger point. Like, you aren't going to just pull down 2,000 MCP servers randomly from the internet and start using them, right? Those, at least in the enterprise, those will need to go through some sort of vetting process and registration process internally, approval process, however you want to look at it. And you will want some sort of consistency when it comes to what the security posture is around those MCP servers. And you're not just going to say, oh, well, this one does it that way, this one does it that way, and it's a completely different way over here. That's probably not going to fly in the enterprise. But yeah, you'll need to have some consistent way to apply authentication, authorization, and what gets exposed from those MCP servers.
And I think one point here is that the MCP server is just another API, right? Like it's just another API. So the same security rules apply there as well. You know, I think to some degree this report is pulling on the hype of MCP right now to get some eyes on it. I mean, if you look at like Docker APIs alone, so just people who have their Docker exposed, fully exposed over the internet. So anybody can run containers or stop containers or kill containers that they have. There's like 4,000 open Docker APIs that are discoverable today, and that's just one API, right? So, I mean, I think if you were to compare this to all APIs, that number's huge. There's tons of anonymously accessible APIs on the internet today, and not all of those are actually like accessing something that should be private, right? There's tons of test servers out there. Developers will go spin up servers all the time just to test things out. They'll go put it on Heroku, or they'll spin it up on some kind of platform as a service, and they'll just leave it there forever. And I think to kind of claim that MCP is already going down a negative security path because there's 2,000 of them exposed. I'm not sure that's the conclusion that I would draw from that.
It's a good counterpoint. Gary, any thoughts?
No, I think it's very different. The developer space and the enterprise space.
Right.
Yeah, I think with enterprise stuff, it's going to be for your employees or your business partners. A lot of it, or authorized customers. It's going to have to be locked down. I think the whole world of MCP and AI is making us think more about security, which is a good thing, and re-examine our current security. And obviously, people see AI as a threat against weak APIs, and so hopefully we see some, where there are insecure APIs today. Hopefully, we see some initiatives to, strengthen those APIs. So maybe that's one of the good side effects of the MCP movement.
Yeah, hopefully. There was one area we wanted to touch on today that we haven't got to yet. It's with business users or citizen developers, whatever you want to call them. What new security gaps arise when business users, not developers, begin using MCP-based workflows? Anyone want to chime in here, Christian?
Yeah, not worrying about security at all.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if these are business users, but we talk with some parts of organizations that are the AI team or the data team, right? And so they're heads down on that kind of stuff. And then they start looking, oh, MCP, and I can pull this MCP server down. They just start doing things. And then when the platform team or the operations team or the security team, API gateway team, they start, all right, we got to move this into production. All right, let's just, and then they take a look at what they've done, and they're like, whoa, no, we can't do that. And the AI team is just like, well, we never even thought about it. That's not even something that we even considered. So I think understanding that some of the things we've already talked about on the LiveCast come into play for those, even for them, for those business developers, citizen developers, or whatever.
Yeah. Anything else on your end, Gary?
No, I've seen that happen in quite a few projects, that people think they're finished when they're not, and because of security, they're completely blocked. So yeah, and I do think there's plenty of gaps in the MCP authorization spec at the moment. Hopefully, it's being worked on now, as Kevin says, you know, and so I think, for example, there's like I say, I think the role of existing APIs could be stressed more, and more complete client sessions that go through, you know, expiry, stepping up scopes and some of those things. I know there's some initiatives like secure elicitations, etc., that are supposed to be coming that hopefully will help with some of this. And because what I'd like to see more is some more end-to-end flows, because I think that's what, you know, secure end-to-end flows. Because the way I've always planned things when I'm doing projects is to, you know, to feel that there's no blocking issues in a sort of end-to-end flow between a user and an AI agent, because that's typically what you need to do at an organization. You need to say, is anything going to block me here? Exactly as Christian just said, where the team has, you know, done this work and then they're blocked, you know, and so do some, I think often it's like an architect or someone has the responsibility of making sure there's no blocking issues. And I'd like to see, you know, like I say, the more complete session behavior and some of that stuff more clearly defined in MCP authorization, some of the hardening stuff for organizations. So I think it will come, but it's being worked on. But the problem is with security, there's often not just one way of doing it. It's not just one design. There's sometimes it depends, like in particular, how you design access tokens varies across each organization. What forms of user authentication varies across each organization. These things aren't fixed, so you have some choice in how you apply the OAuth framework and also the backend gateway related security as well.
Right. Yeah, I think it's good to note too, like most people are on the sidelines here. They're seeing these headlines come out, they're seeing vulnerabilities being published, but they're not participating in active development of the MCP specification itself. So, like in closing, you know, what key takeaways would you like to leave listeners that fall into that category? How should they be addressing things now and then looking forward to the future? Kevin, you want to start this one off?
Yeah, I mean, I think the average person shouldn't care about MCP at all, right?
Oh, okay, yeah, we can go that far.
Right. I mean, I think they shouldn't, right? They're going to be using their chat app, whatever that is, and they're going to have integrations to different systems. They shouldn't have to know that that's MCP or that's not MCP, right? That's kind of the goal of protocols, really, is to become invisible, and just deliver that value. So yeah, I mean, you know, for folks who care about this right now, in the pursuit of making it invisible, it's very, very difficult, right? As Christian mentioned, business users don't want to log into a whole bunch of different things, or like, you know, that's why we have SSO. That's why we have things like SCIM provisioning, is to kind of take that pain away. Right now, that pain still exists on managing a bunch of integrations, and so, you know, I think, how do we take that pain away is probably the thing to focus on. And you know, I've been working a lot with security teams and platform teams who are looking to enable organizations to solve exactly these problems, and with sort of like the tool vendor space as well. How do we provide tools that are going to help these problems? And of course, on the spec side too, how do we have a specification that enables all this? So I think we're still very early on. MCP was introduced in November of 2024. It is now August of 2025. That is not a very long time for a protocol to be around. So we're still in very early days, and I would expect all this to look very different a year from now.
Good points. Christian, any ideas there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll echo what Kevin's saying there. You know, things are going to continue to evolve. I think the spec is getting good input from various folks. I think at the end of the day, especially if you're in an enterprise and you're trying to decide whether, you know, what this should look like for you, well, luckily for you, your enterprise security team has a lot of opinions. You know, security principles still apply. The stuff that we've learned around securing REST APIs and APIs in general still apply. And so the more that the MCP spec starts to go in the direction converging with some of those established patterns and practices and learnings, I think the more comfortable enterprises will become with it. But yeah, there's still a lot more work to be done.
Gary, any closing thoughts or key takeaways?
Yeah, no, just and it's about giving yourself choices. I think that this get your API hosting in the separation of concerns there, and then you can adapt to change as it happens. So.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, yeah, this is a big topic to explore right now, and it's still under development, like Kevin's mentioned, and I think we'll have to check back in a year, as you say, to see
Yeah.
where things are. Because yeah, this
I
protocol
don't even think we have to wait that long. Probably in 3 months, we'll see some interesting updates.
We'll all be embarrassed by our previous answers, perhaps.
Yeah. We'll just edit this video when the time comes. No, seriously, thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing with everyone. And yeah, we'll keep following this where it goes. So
I
yeah,
appreciate it. Thanks for having us. Thanks for organizing it.
Thanks,
absolutely.
everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.